"Grandma smells like old books." That's what my grandson Micah said, right in front of everyone, at our Sunday family brunch. His voice was loud, clear, and a little too proud for a 12-year-old. I froze mid-step, holding a warm tray of cinnamon rolls, the ones he used to beg me to bake when he was little. The scent of brown sugar and cloves filled the room. I remember the way the steam rose gently from the icing, swirling upward, only to be drowned out by the sound of laughter. Not just Micah's, but his mother's too. My daughter Janine chuckled like it was the most harmless joke in the world. I didn't laugh. I didn't speak. I just stood there, suddenly very aware of the cardigan I was wearing, the slight mustiness from the storage boxes I'd pulled books out of earlier that morning for the library donation drive. My arms trembled a little, not from the weight of the tray, but from something else, something deeper. Like shame had made a home in my chest without permission. Janine didn't correct him. No one did. They just carried on. Forks clinked against plates. My son-in-law scrolled through his phone. Micah went back to his orange juice like nothing had happened, and I stood there like an exhibit in a museum no one cared to read the description for anymore. It wasn't just the words. It was how easily they fell from his mouth, as if I were no longer human, as if I were some antique in his life, covered in dust and long overdue to be boxed up and stored away. Micah used to sit in my lap and ask me to read Goodnight Moon 5 times in a row. He used to bring me wildflowers with crooked stems and say, "These smell like books, Grandma. I love them." Somewhere along the way, that memory had morphed into a joke, a punchline, something to laugh at while I stood in the same room, breathing the same air, serving food I made with love. And maybe that's what hurt the most. I was still doing everything the same, but the meaning, it had changed for them. I placed the tray down on the table without a word. No dramatic exit, no cold stare, just quiet hands and a heart that had suddenly grown much heavier. I found my seat in the corner and tried to smile when Janine asked for the butter, but inside something had shifted, a small fracture, one I knew they wouldn't notice, but I felt it, and it was deep. Micah didn't mean to hurt me, I told myself. He's just a boy. Boys say silly things, but it wasn't just the comment. It was what it represented, that slow erasing, that casual dismissal that begins with small words and ends in forgetting someone altogether. I looked around the table, watching my daughter laugh at a story her husband told, watching my grandson nudge his cousin and roll his eyes in my direction. And I wondered, when did I become the background? When did I stop mattering? I used to believe love would protect me from being forgotten, that the years I gave would wrap around me like a shield. But in that moment, I understood something quietly devastating. Love doesn't always come back the way you give it. And so I sat there, not angry, not weeping, but hollow, wondering what to do with this feeling, with this new reality I hadn't planned for. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't start with betrayal in a courtroom or chaos in the street. They start right at your family table, with the people you raised, the ones you love, forgetting who you are. Before that day, I would have told you my life was full, maybe even blessed. Quiet, yes. Predictable, certainly, but full. I had a routine I cherished. Every morning, I'd wake up at 6 sharp, not because I had to, but because I liked the quiet of the house before the world began moving. I'd brew my favorite cinnamon hazelnut coffee, light a candle in the kitchen window, and flip through the local paper. The silence wasn't lonely. It was peaceful, earned. At 64, I wasn't chasing anything anymore. Not a career, not love, not recognition. I had my family, my memories, and most importantly, my rhythm. And at the center of it all was the library. I started volunteering there a few years after I retired, From teaching English at Oak Ridge High, it felt like the natural next step. I had spent decades helping teenagers find their voice through books. Now, I guided younger kids through picture books and read-alongs, helping them fall in love with stories the way I once did. Micah was always with me back then. I used to pick him up from preschool on Wednesdays and take him to the library before Janine got off work. We'd sit on that big blue beanbag near the window reading The Snowy Day or Where the Wild Things Are. He was so curious, so full of questions. Why does the boy walk in the snow barefoot? Or, can books be alive, Grandma? I'd smile and say, they're the most alive things we've got, sweetheart. Janine loved it too. She'd often say, I don't know how you have the patience, Mom. I barely survived the school pickup line. I used to beam with pride when she said things like that. It made me feel needed, not just useful, but trusted. Every Thursday, I'd drop off book donations to the Children's Literacy Program. Micah helped me select them. He once insisted we include his old dinosaur encyclopedia because some other kid might love it more than I did. That day, I cried in the car on the way home. He was only 7, but he already had such a big heart. My neighbors used to tell me how lucky I was to be so close with my daughter and grandson. You're the glue, they'd say. You're the one holding them together. And I believed that. I believed that the dinners I cooked, the errands I ran, the school pickups, the bedtime stories, the quiet sacrifices, I believed they mattered. On weekends, we'd have what Janine called Grandma Sundays. I'd make pot roast or sometimes just grilled cheese and tomato soup if the day felt too hot. Janine would show up in her joggers, hair in a bun, plopping onto the couch while I watched Micah play video games and asked him about school. It was simple. Not glamorous, not loud, but full of the kind of love you don't find in movies, the kind that grows over time, watered by consistency, fed by patience. I didn't realize I was being phased out, that my presence had shifted from cherished to assumed, that over time, the stories Micah once begged me to tell had become background noise to his TikTok scrolling, that my offers to help Janine were more met with, I've got it, than thank you. But I didn't see it then. Back then, I still felt like I mattered. I still believed I was the safe place, the one they'd always come back to. Looking back now, I realize I was living inside a memory, holding on to a version of us that had quietly expired. Like an old library card no one remembered to renew. But in those days before it broke, I truly thought we were still a family. I thought love, once given, would keep returning. I thought I would always be Grandma. Not the butt of the joke, not the afterthought in the room. I thought I'd earned more than just being tolerated. But love, I would soon learn, does not guarantee reverence. Especially when the people you gave everything to forget how to see you. It was a Tuesday. Just one of those days that didn't seem important at the time. I had picked up a few new chapter books from the local bookstore, the kind I knew Micah used to love. He was getting into that awkward tween stage where he still liked dragons and space battles, but pretended not to. I thought a quiet gift might remind him of our old library afternoons. The way we used to read together, sprawled across the living room carpet. I placed the books in a reusable canvas tote and stopped by Janine's house. She had asked me to drop off a few things, dry cleaning, a prescription refill, nothing big. I rang the bell and waited. Micah opened the door. No smile, just a quick glance and a half-hearted, "Hey." "I brought you something," I said, lifting the tote. "You'll like these. There's a new one by that author you liked. The one with the time-traveling scientist." He glanced at the bag, then back at me. "Oh, cool." His tone was flat. He didn't reach for the bag, didn't ask what the titles were, just turned back toward the hallway and muttered, "You can leave it on the table or whatever." I stood there for a second, still holding the bag. It was small, but something in me tightened. I walked into the kitchen, placed it gently on the counter, and turned to leave when I heard his voice float back to me. "Mom, Grandma brought more of her weird old books again. Not angry, not mean, just careless." Janine didn't respond right away. She was probably in the laundry room, or maybe she didn't hear. I lingered near the front door for a moment, waiting, hoping, really, for her to say something, to correct him, to remind him that those weird old books were part of his childhood, that I had once sat beside his bed and read to him until he drifted off with his hand resting on my arm. But nothing came. I drove home in silence, the radio off. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. I tried to shrug it off. Kids say dumb things. It doesn't mean anything. But it did. It meant something. It meant that I was starting to shift in his eyes. From Grandma, the magical book bringer, the cocoa maker, the steady hug after a scraped knee, to something forgettable, outdated, background noise. I told myself he was just having a bad day. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe it's a phase. But the next time I called to ask if Micah wanted to join me at the library's weekend storytelling event, Janine answered and said, "He's not really into those things anymore, Mom. He's kind of outgrown that stuff." Outgrown me, she meant. I remember the silence that followed her words. Not angry, not cold, just empty. She didn't notice the pause. She just moved on. "Anyway, thanks for running those errands. Love you." I said I loved her too, but something inside me felt different after that call. That night, I sat in my favorite chair with a worn copy of A Wrinkle in Time. I ran my hand over the faded cover, remembering when Micah used to point to the illustrations and ask me to do the voices. I had spent hours learning them, trying to make the characters come alive for him. Now those pages felt like memories from someone else's life. It was a small moment, just a passing comment, a casual tone, but it stayed with me, like a sliver under the skin. Not enough to cause pain right away, but impossible to ignore. That was the first time I felt it. Not just the distance, but the dismissal. A soft warning that something was shifting in the foundation of the family I thought I'd always belonged to. It didn't happen all at once. There was no explosion, no confrontation, just a slow erosion, like wind and water wearing down the edges of something that used to stand tall. At first, I told myself it was normal, that children grow, that mothers step back, that grandmothers fade a little into the background. But I started noticing patterns. Micah stopped saying, "I love you," at the end of our calls. At first, he'd say "you too" when I'd whisper it before hanging up. Then it became a quick bye, then just silence. It was subtle, the way he began to shrink me. At family dinners, he wouldn't sit beside me anymore. He'd pick a spot closer to his cousin Kai or his stepdad, slumping deep into his seat, eyes on his phone. I'd try to ask about school, about his science project. He loved astronomy once. But he'd shrug or grunt or say, "I don't remember." And it wasn't just him. Janine had changed too. She started talking to me like I was a helper, not a partner, not a mother, but someone she could assign tasks to. "Could you pick up Micah's uniform from the dry cleaner? Can you be here at 4 to wait for the Wi-Fi technician?" Never, "How are you, Mom?" Never, "Do you need anything?" And yet, I kept showing up. I still made banana bread on Thursdays because I knew it used to be Micah's favorite. I still left little notes in the front pocket of his backpack. "Good luck on your test, champ." One came back unopened weeks later, crumpled at the bottom, untouched. One afternoon, I stopped by to drop off a small book on coding I found at a garage sale. Micah didn't even come downstairs. I stood in the hallway while Janine called up, "Mom brought you something," and got nothing back but a muffled, "I'm busy." Janine just laughed it off. Teenagers don't take it personally. But I did. Not out of ego, but out of love. Because I remembered a little boy who once ran to the door in mismatched socks just to tell me he lost a tooth. I remembered a daughter who used to call me crying when Micah had a fever, saying, "I don't know what I'd do without you." And now I was the forgotten chair in the corner of their lives, expected to be there, but never really seen. The house felt colder after every visit, not because of the temperature, but because of the silence. the kind that grows when people talk around you instead of with you, when laughter happens and your name is never part of it. One Sunday, I brought over a memory box I had kept from Micah's early years, finger paintings, birthday cards, the little knitted cap he wore home from the hospital. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd sit with me and remember. Maybe we'd laugh. Maybe he'd feel something. He glanced inside the box and said, "Is this all just baby stuff?" Just baby stuff. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, holding that tiny knitted cap in my hands. I closed my eyes and tried to hear the sound of his infant cry, tried to remember the weight of his body curled against my chest. But all I could hear was the emptiness of his tone, echoing louder than any newborn wail ever had. That's when the loneliness began to settle. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from realizing you're no longer wanted. And yet I kept telling myself it would turn around, that maybe he was just growing, that maybe Janine was stressed, that maybe I needed to be more patient, more helpful, more useful. But no matter what I gave, it felt like I was disappearing, like I was becoming invisible inside the family I helped build from the ground up. The moment that broke something in me didn't happen behind closed doors. It happened in the middle of a sunny afternoon at a community brunch I had helped organize for years. The event was held every spring in the town square, a potluck picnic meant to bring together local families, volunteers, and library donors. I'd baked my signature cranberry orange scones, wrapped in parchment and twine like I always did. I'd even printed little labels with a quote from Emily Dickinson, "Forever is composed of nows." Micah used to love these events. As a kid, he'd help me arrange the baked goods table, sneaking extra scones when he thought I wasn't looking. He'd run around with the other kids, his laughter carrying through the breeze like wind chimes. But this time was different. He didn't want to come. Janine had practically dragged him, muttering to me as they arrived, "He's in one of his moods today, just ignore it." I tried. I really did. He hovered near the edge of the crowd with his arms folded, headphones looped around his neck, and that glazed-over look only teenagers can perfect. I caught his eye and smiled, holding up a book-themed tote bag I'd filled with small prizes for the kids. Bookmarks, coloring sheets, even comic books. He used to love helping me pass them out. "Want to help me give these out again, sweetheart?" I asked, hopeful. He looked at me, then looked around, checking, I imagine, to see who might be watching. And then he said it, loud enough for the group of kids near him to hear, loud enough for the moms arranging folding chairs, loud enough for my spine to stiffen before the words even fully landed. "Why do you always have to act like this is your thing, Grandma? You're not even cool. You smell like old books and like old people. It's embarrassing." Someone laughed, a quick, awkward laugh. Not because it was funny, but because no one knew what else to do. Janine turned just as I stood, frozen, the prize bag clutched in my hands. She gave him a sharp look, but said nothing. Nothing meaningful. Just a soft, "Micah, don't be rude," before turning back to her phone. I stood there. Not furious, not defensive, just hollow. Micah didn't apologize. He just slipped his headphones on and wandered toward the food table, leaving me surrounded by parents and children I had once read stories to, who now glanced at me with tight smiles and lowered eyes. The bag in my hands felt impossibly heavy. My arms shook, my throat tightened, but I forced myself to keep going. I handed out the bookmarks. I thanked people for coming. I posed for a photo with the mayor and a check-sized donation envelope. But inside, something cracked. Not because Micah was cruel. I don't believe he truly meant to wound me, but because he didn't see me anymore. I wasn't Grandma, the reader, the storyteller, the woman who stayed up late sewing his Halloween costume when Janine was overwhelmed, the woman who once held him for 2 hours straight in the emergency room, whispering lullabies while he waited to be stitched up after a playground fall. Number one was just an old woman who smelled like old books. When the event ended, I gathered the leftover scones and packed them into Tupperware, hands moving on autopilot. No one offered to help, No one asked if I was okay. I walked home alone that afternoon, the bright sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk. I placed the untouched scones on my kitchen counter, removed the parchment labels with shaking hands, and sat in my reading chair without opening a single book. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a part of anything. I felt like a relic. And that pain, that very specific pain of being laughed at by someone you raised, it doesn't scream. It settles, quietly, deeply, and it changes you. After the brunch, something inside me turned off. Like a light I didn't know how to switch. I didn't call Janine the next day. I didn't text Micah to ask how his week was going. I didn't stop by with banana bread or suggest another library event. I just paused. It wasn't anger. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't giving anyone the silent treatment. I just felt done. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like showing up. That following Tuesday, the library called. It was Rachel, the coordinator for the Children's Outreach Program. "Hey, Lorene, just confirming you and Micah are still on for this Friday's reading day. He's still listed for the donation presentation." I looked at the phone resting in my hand. For a moment, I saw my own reflection in the darkened screen. Tired eyes, neat hair, a cardigan with a faint ink smudge from sorting used books. Micah's name sat there like a weight. I cleared my throat. "Number he won't be attending. Please remove him from the list." Rachel hesitated. "Oh, okay. Should I just cancel the whole segment?" "No," I said, firmer this time. "I have someone else in mind." That night, I stood at the kitchen window, sipping tea and watching the lights flicker on in the house next door. I could just make out a small figure in the window, little Noah Martinez, drawing at the kitchen table. He was 9, maybe 10, lived with his mother, Elena, who worked 2 jobs and still managed to wave every morning when I got the mail. Noah loved books. I knew because one day he stopped me outside with wide eyes and said, "Are you the lady who brings books in the baskets?" I smiled and said I was. He nodded seriously and said, "Books are like secret doors. That's what my teacher says. Do you have any about space?" I did. I always had something about space. The next morning, I called Elena and asked if Noah would be interested in attending Friday's library event with me. There was a pause, then a cautious, surprised, "Yes, he'd love that." And just like that, Micah's name was erased from something he never truly appreciated, not out of spite, but out of a quiet realization. I didn't have to keep offering myself to people who treated me like a placeholder. On Friday, Noah showed up early with a too-big backpack and a grin that lit up the whole library. He held my hand as we walked in, and when I introduced him to the volunteers, he didn't look away in embarrassment. He beamed, like he belonged. And for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Chosen. That weekend, Janine texted me a photo of Micah at a birthday party. Face painted, smiling with friends. No caption, no check-in, just a silent reminder that their world was still spinning. Whether or not I was in it, I didn't reply. And I didn't feel guilty, because slowly I was learning the difference between being needed and being valued. One was a burden disguised as love. The other was a choice. The silence in my house felt different now. Not sharp, not hollow, just still. And in that stillness, I could hear my own thoughts again. I began to realize I hadn't truly left. I had been leaving for a while. With every ignored message, every brushed-off invitation, every moment I swallowed my hurt so someone else could stay comfortable. And now, I had finally stopped swallowing. I didn't announce my absence. I didn't explain my distance. I simply began redirecting my energy. To someone who smiled when I walked into the room, to places that welcomed me without asking for more than I could give, to a life that still had space for joy. Even if it wasn't the one I had imagined. Grief doesn't always come after death. Sometimes it walks in slowly, takes a seat at your kitchen table, and makes itself at home while you're still trying to set out the plates. That week, after I removed Micah from the library list and quietly redirected my energy elsewhere, I expected to feel empowered or relieved, but I didn't. Not right away. What I felt instead was something harder to name. It was a Thursday when it really hit me, the day we used to call our day. I'd pick up Micah from school, we'd swing by the library, and we'd have grilled cheese sandwiches at the park. I had followed that same ritual for nearly a decade. It was a rhythm stitched into my bones. And now, suddenly, it was just a blank space in my week. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the sandwich press on the counter, wondering if I should even bother cooking. The house was silent. Too silent. Not the good kind, not the peaceful kind that comes after a long day. This silence had edges. It felt sharp, pressing. I didn't turn on music. I didn't call anyone. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the mug in front of me, the one Micah had painted in second grade for Grandparents' Day. It said Book Queen in big, crooked blue letters with little yellow stars. It was chipped on the handle now. I hadn't noticed that before. I reached for it slowly and ran my finger along the crack. I remembered the day he gave it to me. How proud he was. "Because you read the most books in the world," he had said, hugging me so hard my glasses smudged. That same mug now sat cold and empty. I suddenly felt very old, not in the way of aching knees or stiff shoulders, but in the way of no longer being needed, of being past my moment, of having been important once in a life that had quietly moved on without me. I left the sandwich ingredients on the counter and walked down the hall to the guest bedroom, Micah's room when he stayed over. The door creaked the same way it always had, but the room looked different now. The bed was still made, sheets crisp and untouched. A few books were stacked neatly on the nightstand, books I had saved just for him. His drawings were still pinned to the corkboard above the desk. Rockets, dragons, a treehouse sketch we planned together. He'd labeled it Grandma's Library in the Sky. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the emptiness bloom in my chest. This used to be our room, a place of whispered bedtime stories and flashlight shadow puppets. Now it was a museum of a bond that had thinned to silence. I didn't cry right away. That came later. What I did do, something I can still see clearly, was open the bottom drawer of the dresser. Inside were the keepsakes I'd collected quietly over the years. His baby booties, a lock of his hair from his first haircut, a paper crown he made out of construction paper and glitter glue. In the center of it all was a photo, Micah, maybe age 5, hugging me tight with both arms, his face buried in my sweater. I held that photo for a long time, and then I cried. Not loud, not desperate, just slow, steady tears that slipped down my cheeks and soaked the edge of the picture. I wept for the time I'd lost, for the closeness that had vanished without a clear goodbye, for the quiet way love can fade when no one fights for it. I wept for who I used to be to him and who I no longer was. And as the light dimmed through the curtains and the room settled into evening, I sat there, not moving, not speaking, just existing in the weight of it all. That was rock bottom. Not a breakdown, not a dramatic collapse. Just a quiet realization that the version of my life I'd built my joy around was gone. A few days after that evening in Micah's old room, I found myself in the attic, not looking for anything in particular, just trying to quiet the noise in my own mind. That's what I do when the silence becomes too loud. I organize things. The attic was warm and smelled of cedar and thyme, like forgotten wood and dust-covered memories. Old boxes were stacked neatly in the corners, each one carefully labeled in my handwriting. Winter coats, Christmas lights, Janine's art projects, books to keep. I wasn't planning to open the blue tin trunk in the back. It had been years since I touched it. It held keepsakes from my teaching years, letters from students, photographs of my classroom bulletin boards, lesson plans I couldn't bring myself to throw away. But something pulled me toward it. I opened the trunk slowly, the hinges creaking with age, and began leafing through the contents. Near the bottom, beneath a bundle of faded thank you notes, I found a small brown journal tied with a fraying ribbon. My breath caught. I knew this journal. It was the one I kept during Micah's early years, the one I wrote in when Janine had just returned to work and I was taking care of him full time. I had almost forgotten it existed. I held it in my hands for a long time before finally untying the ribbon. The first page was dated March 4th, 2013. Micah is 5 months old today. He smiled at me with his whole body this morning, like he knew I was his home. I've never felt more needed or more terrified of how much I love him. I kept reading. Page after page, I found a map of our shared history, small moments that had once seemed ordinary but were now priceless. He said Grandma today, clear as anything. Janine didn't believe it, but I know what I heard. He fell asleep on my chest while I read Harold and the Purple Crayon. I kept reading long after he drifted off. We watched a thunderstorm from the window. I told him the clouds were drummers in the sky. He believed me. My fingers trembled as I turned each page. I had written about my fears of being forgotten, even back then. How I hoped the memories would stick. How I prayed he'd grow up knowing how deeply he was loved. And then I came to an entry that stopped me cold. If he forgets me one day, I hope I'll be brave enough to remember myself, to know I was good, that I gave love, not because I expected anything, but because I was love. I read it 3 times, because in that moment I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see through the grief. I was never just his grandma. I was my own person, whole, complete, not defined by how anyone else saw me. Micah had changed. Our bond had faded. But what I gave was real. It had been meaningful. And just because he no longer saw it, didn't make it disappear. That journal reminded me of who I had been long before I became invisible in my own family. A woman with purpose, imagination, and so much to give, not just to Micah, but to anyone willing to receive it. I sat there for hours, sunlight filtering through the attic slats, surrounded by the echoes of my own handwriting. It was like meeting myself again, the version of me who believed in love, in learning, in the power of quiet moments to shape a life. And slowly, something began to shift in me. Not a sudden change, but the beginning of something small and important. The sense that maybe I hadn't reached the end of my story after all. Maybe I had just finished a chapter. The day after I found the journal, I didn't cry. I didn't sit in Micah's room or stare at the past like it owed me something. I woke up, made my coffee, and sat outside in the garden with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The air was crisp and clean, the kind that fills your lungs in a way that feels like beginning again. I didn't turn on my phone. I didn't check for messages. I didn't wait for anyone to ask me how I was doing. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for permission to feel whole. As I sipped my coffee, I opened the journal again, not out of pain, but out of curiosity. I wasn't looking for memories anymore. I was looking for the parts of me I had buried in those pages, the parts I used to protect everyone else, to hold up Janine, to shape Micah, to keep everything running. And in reading, I started remembering who I was before I began disappearing. I had taught hundreds of students to find their voice. I had organized 3 library drives that built entire reading rooms for underserved schools. I had run my own book club for 15 years, edited local authors' manuscripts, and once spent a summer writing poetry that no one ever saw. When did I stop seeing myself? When did I trade all of that in for being just grandma? It wasn't their fault entirely. I had given myself away in pieces, little by little, saying yes to every request, holding back my own needs, thinking that love meant sacrifice, and only sacrifice. But now, the fog was clearing, and what I saw underneath surprised me. There was still someone there, someone sturdy, someone capable, someone kind. Not because she was someone's mother or grandmother, but because she had always been those things and so much more. That afternoon, I went into Micah's room, not to ache, but to gather. I packed up the books I'd kept for him, the ones he used to love, the ones he now called baby stuff. I placed them gently in a box and set them aside for Noah. He still cared. He still lit up when I talked about the magic hidden in stories. Then I walked into my bedroom and pulled out a worn leather folder from the back of the closet. Inside were a dozen poems I had written over the years. Some typed, some scribbled on napkins and receipts. I read each one slowly. I had forgotten how much I used to love words for myself, not just for others. That night, I opened a fresh notebook and began to write again. Not about pain, not about Micah or Janine. I wrote about a sunrise, about the smell of old lavender in a book spine, about finding silence that didn't hurt but healed. It wasn't a bold declaration. It wasn't a transformation anyone could see from the outside, but I could feel it. Something inside me had stopped clinging to what was gone. I was no longer begging for crumbs of affection from people who hadn't even noticed they'd stopped feeding me. I was no longer measuring my worth by how often I was needed. Instead, I was quietly rebuilding something that had always belonged to me, my identity. And it didn't require anyone's applause. That was the beginning of my awakening. It didn't come with fireworks or revelations. It came with stillness, with honesty, with the soft return of my own voice. And with it came a whisper of something I hadn't felt in months: power. Not the loud kind, not the kind that roars into a room demanding to be seen, but the kind that stands in the mirror and recognizes its own reflection again, and smiles. It's strange how power can return without a sound. After months of feeling invisible, I didn't wake up and shout, "I'm back." I simply began. There was no need for confrontation, no dramatic speech, just small, steady decisions that started with one quiet word I hadn't used enough in recent years: no. The first came when Janine texted on a Tuesday afternoon. "Hey, Mom, can you swing by and wait for the appliance delivery? I've got meetings all day." For years, I would have replied instantly with, "Of course, sweetheart." I would have rearranged my day, skipped my morning walk, and sat in their kitchen waiting for someone else's responsibility to show up. But this time, I stared at the message, and then I replied, "Sorry, I'm not available. Hope it goes smoothly." No apology, no long explanation, just a boundary. The silence that followed was longer than usual, but I didn't chase it. That same afternoon, I reached out to Rachel at the library. "I'd like to formally shift my literacy sponsorship to another child," I said, calm and clear. "His name is Noah Martinez. I've already spoken to his mother. He's bright, kind, and passionate about reading." Rachel didn't question it. She simply said, "That's wonderful. I'll update the paperwork today." I hung up the phone and sat for a long moment in the quiet. Not sad, not triumphant, just settled. The decision felt right. Not reactive, but restorative. Later that week, I drove to the community center and picked up a volunteer application for the adult literacy program. It was something I'd thought about for years, but always put off. Life was full. Family needed me. Now, for the first time in a long time, my calendar belonged to me. I didn't tell Janine. I didn't mention it to Micah, not because I was being secretive, but because I had nothing to prove. This new part of my life didn't require their awareness or their blessing. It was mine. That Saturday, I pulled out a few older boxes from the guest room closet and began to sort through them. I found old teaching materials, my college thesis, and a small envelope filled with rejection letters from when I once tried to publish my poetry. I smiled, not bitterly, just fondly. Because for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a failure for letting those dreams go. I had simply set them aside to build something else, a family, a legacy, a life of service. But now, I could reach for those dreams again if I wanted, not to prove I was still worth something, but because I wanted to. I ordered a new bookshelf for my home office and filled it with only the books that made me feel alive, not the ones I thought I was supposed to read for someone else's benefit. I bought a small potted orchid and placed it near the window. It bloomed white and slow, and it reminded me of myself. One morning, Noah came over with a thank you card he made himself. His handwriting was uneven, and the paper was wrinkled, but I couldn't stop reading it. "Thank you for picking me. I feel like books are my friends now." I pinned that card next to the corkboard where Micah's drawings used to hang, not to replace the past, but to make room for the present. A week later, Janine called again. Her voice was rushed, as usual. "Mom, I forgot to ask. You're still on for the school carpool next Thursday, right?" There was a time I would have scrambled to check my planner. Instead, I answered calmly, "No, Janine, I have a commitment that day." She was quiet for a beat. "Oh, okay. Well, I'll figure it out." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for choosing myself. I simply placed my phone down, poured another cup of tea, and opened the poetry notebook I'd been adding to. The words were slow in coming, but they were mine, and that was enough. No one knew what was happening. Not really. There were no visible fireworks or big announcements, but underneath the quiet, a shift was taking place, and soon the people who had overlooked me would feel it. Because when a woman begins to reclaim her time, her space, and her voice, she doesn't need to shout. Her silence becomes its own form of power. It was around the second week of my silence when things started to shift. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small, noticeable ways. Janine's texts became more frequent, not warmer, just more insistent. "Hey, are you free to watch Micah next weekend? I have a work thing." "Mom, you didn't answer. Can you let me know soon?" I waited a day before replying, then wrote simply, "I have plans." It was true. I had plans. With myself, with my time, with the peace I had started protecting like something sacred. I had no interest in being their backup plan anymore. Janine didn't push back, at least not directly, but I could hear it in her voice the next time she called, something softer, something unsure. "Everything okay, Mom?" "Yes," I said. "Everything's fine." And it was. For the first time in a long time. At the library, Noah's eyes lit up as he told me about a book he was reading about time machines. "If I had one," he said, "I'd go back and meet authors when they were writing." "Wouldn't that be cool?" I smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, that would be very cool." Rachel had asked me if I'd consider mentoring a few other students from the local school who needed help with reading comprehension. "You just have a way of making them feel seen," she said, "like you see who they are and not just their test scores." I hadn't felt that kind of affirmation in years, not from Janine, not from Micah, certainly not from a house where I'd slowly become the default maid, driver, and backup parent. But these children, they looked at me the way Micah once had, with trust, with openness, with wonder. One Friday evening, I was getting ready to leave for a poetry open mic at the community center. I wasn't reading, not yet, but I'd promised myself I'd attend, even just to listen, even just to remember that I still belonged to the world of words. As I reached for my coat, my phone rang. It was Janine. I let it ring once, twice, then picked up. "Hi, Mom," she said quickly. "I forgot to tell you, Micah got nominated for the science fair. It's kind of a big deal." I took a breath. I mean that I've spent years giving without question, being here, always. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being seen as a person and started being treated like a convenience. Janine's face flushed. "Mom, that's not fair." "It's honest," I replied calmly. "And I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because I finally stopped lying to myself." Micah finally looked at me. His face was unreadable, part teenage discomfort, part something else. "You know," I said, turning gently to him, "when you said I smelled like old books, I don't think you knew how deeply that cut. Because those books, that smell, It's part of who I am. It's the scent of years spent teaching, reading, loving. You. He shifted in his chair. I didn't mean it like that. I know, I said softly, but you did say it. And what hurt more wasn't the words. It was the silence after. No one defended me. No one asked if I was okay. Janine looked down at her plate. I let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as reflection. I'm not angry anymore, I added, but I won't keep showing up where I'm not respected. I have more to give, but I'm choosing to give it where it's appreciated. Micah's voice was small. Are you mad at me? I looked him in the eyes. No, sweetheart, I'm not mad. I'm just finally awake. They didn't know what to say, and that was okay. I gathered my things, stood up, and offered a gentle smile. I'll let you know if I can make it to Recognition Day, but if I do, it'll be because I want to, not because I'm expected to. And then I walked to the door, coat over my arm, heart steady. Because sometimes the most powerful confrontation isn't a blow-up, it's a boundary. And when spoken with grace, it echoes louder than any scream ever could. A few weeks after that dinner, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a text, but a proper letter. The return address was from the Regional Library Board. At first, I assumed it was something routine, maybe a donation receipt or an event flyer. But when I opened it, I found something entirely different. It was a formal invitation. I had been selected as the honoree for the Community Literacy Advocate of the Year Award. The ceremony would be held during the statewide reading festival with an expected audience of educators, librarians, and hundreds of families. I was invited to speak. I blinked at the paper, rereading it 3 times. Me, not Grandma, not Janine's mother, not Micah's babysitter, just Lorene McKay. I felt something bloom in my chest. Not pride, exactly. Something older, deeper, recognition. The kind I hadn't felt in years. Someone had seen me, and not just seen me, they had valued me, and it got better. The board had reviewed my proposal for the youth donation redirection, the one where I'd requested the grant funds be transferred to a student who demonstrated both enthusiasm and need. They approved it. In fact, they expanded it. Noah Martinez would not only receive a scholarship to attend the summer readers camp, but the grant was now being renamed in my honor, the Lorene McKay Literacy Fund. It felt full circle. Later that week, I received a call from Rachel at the library. She was breathless with excitement. You're going to be the closing speaker for the festival, Lorene. It's a huge deal. Your story, what you've done. People need to hear it. I sat with the phone to my ear and stared out the window at my garden, sunlight catching on the petals of my white orchid, and I smiled. The world hadn't passed me by after all. I had just stopped trying to prove myself in rooms where no one was listening. Now I was being invited to a stage where my voice mattered. A week before the event, I got a text from Janine. Micah didn't get into the reading camp. There was only one slot. I stared at the message for a long time. The same camp I had once dreamed Micah would attend. The one we'd talked about years ago as we sat cross-legged reading space books and eating peanut butter crackers on the rug. The camp he'd taken for granted. The slot was now Noah's, and I wouldn't change a thing. I replied simply, yes, I know. I nominated someone who truly wanted it. Janine didn't respond right away. When she finally did, her words were clipped. So you're punishing Micah now? I took a breath, then answered, no. I'm honoring someone else's enthusiasm. That's not punishment, that's redirection. There was no reply after that, and for the first time, I didn't need one. The night of the festival arrived. The auditorium was buzzing with families, teachers, and readers of every age. I wore a deep navy dress, the same one I'd worn to Janine's graduation years ago, before Micah was born. It still fit. But more importantly, I fit. In this space, in this purpose, in this version of myself. That's wonderful, I said, meaning it. You're coming, right? I paused, not to be cruel, just to choose. I'll have to check my calendar. There was silence on the line, the kind that said more than any argument could. "I mean, it's this Saturday," she added, as if that made my schedule suddenly flexible. "I understand, I'll check." And I did check. I had already committed to helping Noah prep for his own presentation that weekend, a small reading showcase for the children's corner at the library. He had asked me if I'd stand beside him while he read his short story aloud, and I had said yes. I wasn't going to break that promise. Saturday came. I didn't go to Micah's science fair. I didn't text to ask how it went. I spent my day at the library, sitting in the front row, clapping the loudest when Noah finished reading his story. A tale about a lonely robot who discovers that books can talk to him when no one else does. After the event, as we sat outside eating cookies and sipping juice from paper cups, Noah leaned over and said, "Ms. Lorene, I hope you never stop reading with me." "I don't plan to," I replied. Later that evening, I received a short text from Janine. "Micah asked why you weren't there today." I stared at the message, heart steady, no tears. I replied, because I was somewhere I was needed and appreciated. No explanation, no guilt, just truth. And that truth had weight. They were starting to feel my absence now, not because I was punishing them, but because the space I had always filled without question was no longer available. The old version of me, always on call, always agreeable, was gone. In her place was someone quieter, someone stronger, someone they didn't recognize yet, but they would. The confrontation didn't happen the way I used to imagine it. No yelling, no teary apologies, no sudden awakening from anyone else. It happened on a plain Wednesday evening, over lukewarm coffee and a half-hearted invitation I almost declined. Janine had called earlier that week. "Micah wants to see you," she said like it was an afterthought. "Why don't you come by Wednesday? Nothing big, just dinner." It had been weeks since I'd been in their home. The thought of returning made something twist in my chest. Not fear, exactly, just memory. Memory of all the versions of me that once existed there. The version who said yes to everything, who brought over homemade soup when no one asked, who quietly swallowed disappointment like it was part of the family recipe. But I agreed to come, not because I missed them, but because I no longer needed their love to validate my worth. That changed everything. When I arrived, the house looked the same, but I didn't feel the same inside it. I stepped in, politely took off my shoes, and offered a light smile. Janine greeted me with an air of relief, and Micah, now eye level with me, still thin as a reed, gave me a brief, unsure nod. "Hi, Grandma." "Hello, Micah." We sat at the table. The food was fine. The conversation awkward. No one brought up what had been said. No one brought up what had been lost. They expected me to settle back into the same seat, the same rhythm, like nothing had changed. But I had changed. Janine made small talk about work. Micah said school was fine. They asked how I'd been. I said I'd started volunteering with a new group of children at the library, that I was writing again, that I was busy and happy. Janine blinked. "Oh, that's good." There was a pause, the kind that invites a pivot, and then it came. "Micah's school is doing a student recognition day next month," she said, refilling her water glass. "I told him you might come." I looked at Micah. He didn't meet my eyes. "Is that what you want?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "I guess. Yeah, if you're not too busy or whatever." I placed my fork down carefully, the clink against the plate louder than I expected. I folded my hands and looked at both of them. "I'd like to come," I said, "but not as a placeholder, not as someone who fills in the background quietly and leaves unnoticed." Janine's expression shifted. "What do you mean?" When I stepped up to the podium, I looked out into the crowd and saw Noah sitting in the front row beside his mother. He waved enthusiastically. Micah wasn't there. Janine wasn't either. And still, I was whole. I shared my story. Not the pain, not the betrayal, but the rediscovery. I spoke about the quiet power of literacy, the invisible labor of women who carry families while letting their own dreams collect dust, and the importance of seeing children who see you back. When I finished, the applause filled the hall, not polite, not obligated, real. As I stepped down from the stage, Noah ran up and hugged me. "You're famous now," he whispered. "You're a hero." I chuckled, brushing a hand through his hair. I don't need to be famous. I just needed to remember who I was. Because justice doesn't always come in courtrooms or arguments. Sometimes it's a simple redirection of love, from the ones who stopped seeing you to the ones who never will. It was almost a week after the literacy festival when I heard a knock on the door. Not a text, not a call. A real knock, hesitant, unfamiliar. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened it to find Janine standing there, holding a small paper bag from the bakery down the street. She looked tired. Not in the way a mother is always tired, but in the way someone is when they've finally realized the ground has shifted beneath them. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Janine." She held out the bag like an offering. "I brought those raspberry scones you like." I nodded, stepped aside. "Come in." We sat at the kitchen table in silence for a few moments. She looked around, eyes landing on the blooming orchid by the window, the neat stack of poetry journals on the counter, the flyer from the literacy festival still tacked to the fridge with a magnet that read, "Readers are leaders." "I saw the video," she said finally. "Oh? Of your speech. Someone posted it online. You were amazing." I gave her a quiet smile. "Thank you." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't know you were doing all that." It was a rainy Monday when Janine showed up at my door. No call, no warning, just the sound of hesitant knocking and the blur of her figure through the frosted glass. I had just poured myself a cup of lemon tea and sat down with a poetry collection I'd been meaning to finish. When I opened the door, she stood there awkwardly, holding a small plastic container. "Hi," she said. "I brought muffins. Micah made them." I stepped aside wordlessly and gestured for her to come in. We walked into the kitchen like strangers who used to be something else. She placed the container on the counter and looked around, as if checking to see what had changed. I watched her eyes pause on the new bookshelf, the framed photo of Noah and me at the library event, the stack of books I was actively annotating. "You've been busy," she said. "I have." She nodded slowly, folding her arms. "Micah was upset about the reading camp." I didn't reply right away. I sipped my tea and let the silence stretch, not to be cold, but because I didn't feel the need to fill it anymore. That in itself was new. I think he didn't realize what it meant to him until he lost it, Janine added finally. "He's been quiet lately, kept saying, 'Grandma doesn't come around anymore.'" I met her eyes. "That's because I stopped showing up uninvited." She blinked. "I know." There it was. No excuses, no performance. Just truth. She exhaled and leaned against the counter. "I think I let him take you for granted. I think I did too. I let those words land where they needed to. I didn't jump in to make her feel better. I didn't soften the moment. She had come, and she had spoken. That was enough. "You were always there," she continued, "even when I didn't deserve it, even when he didn't see you." I nodded slowly. That was the problem, Janine. I was always there, no matter how I was treated. And then one day, I realized I didn't have to be. She swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "I didn't come here to ask for anything. I guess I wanted you to know that we noticed, that it hurt when you stepped back, and that you were right to do it." Her voice cracked just slightly. "I didn't realize how much space you filled until it was gone." I looked at my daughter. This woman I had raised, supported, and watched become someone I no longer recognized for a time. She was standing in my kitchen, not as a child needing something, but as a woman finally facing the mirror. I reached out, gently touched her hand. "I forgive you," I said, "but I don't need to return to how things were." Janine nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I know, I wouldn't expect that. For the first time in a long time, we weren't circling the same pain. We were standing on opposite sides of a quiet truth, and for once I didn't feel like I owed her my softness. I offered it anyway, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Micah didn't come with her that day, and that was fine. Some lessons are best learned in the long silence after someone stops showing up. As Janine turned to leave, she hesitated in the doorway. Would you maybe want to come for dinner sometime next month? No expectations. Just to sit with us? I considered it. I'll think about it, I said kindly. She smiled through her tears. That's fair. When the door closed behind her, I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I sat back down, picked up my tea, and opened my book. Because I had learned something life-changing. Closure doesn't come from being asked back. It comes from knowing you can return, and choosing not to. It was early spring when the last of the daffodils bloomed in my garden. They came up late this year, timid, almost reluctant. But when they opened, they did so fully, stretching toward the sun with unapologetic color. I sat on the back porch that morning, wrapped in a shawl, a book in my lap, and a warm mug in my hands. The world felt quiet, not in that hollow way it once had, but in the way a room feels after you finally cleaned it. Aired out the dust, opened the windows, and let light flood in. The life I had built, for years, had revolved around others. My calendar, my energy, my emotional bandwidth. All of it was spent trying to make sure everyone else was fed, comfortable, unbothered. And for a long time, I had believed that was love. But now I knew better. Love isn't the absence of boundaries. It's not shrinking so others can stretch. Real love, the kind that holds weight and is mutual. It honors, it sees, and it returns. Micah never did attend the next library event, and I never asked him to. He sent me a short note through Janine later that month, scribbled on the back of a science worksheet. Sorry for what I said. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just didn't think. I miss you. It was the first time in over a year that he'd reached out without being prompted. I kept the note tucked in the back of my poetry notebook. Not as a prize, but as a reminder. People change. Sometimes slowly, sometimes too late. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't building my joy around the hope of being asked back into rooms I used to clean in silence. Instead, I was building something new. The adult literacy class I'd started teaching had grown. I had 4 students now, all over 50, all determined to read their first novel before the year was up. Every Thursday, we sat in a small circle with battered paperbacks and wide eyes. They reminded me that beginnings don't care about age. They only require permission. Noah came over every weekend. He had started writing his own short stories, wild, brilliant tales about space cats and talking clocks. He read them to me with full voice acting and dramatic pauses, and I listened like it was gospel, because for him, it was. Sometimes I'd pass by the old photo of Micah and me, the one where we're both grinning, cheeks pressed together, joy unfiltered. I didn't avoid it anymore. I didn't ache. I just smiled. We had a good chapter, and it ended. That didn't make it meaningless. One afternoon, I took a stack of my old journals, the ones I'd kept since before Micah was born, and boxed them carefully. Not to throw away, but to store for myself. A time capsule of who I was, who I became, and how I found my way back. I labeled the box with a single word, kept, because that's what I finally was, kept by myself. Not waiting to be claimed, not trying to be essential, just whole. The last entry I wrote in my journal that spring said this: let the ones who never saw you think you disappeared. Let the ones who laughed at your quiet forget how you held everything together. And let yourself bloom anyway, loud, software late, doesn't matter, bloom for you. I closed the notebook, breathed in the soft scent of paper and jasmine tea, and watched a hummingbird pause by the window feeder, still suspended for a split second in the morning air. That's how it felt, not like a triumph, not like revenge, like release. And in that stillness, I found everything I had been looking for, not in their eyes, not in their validation, but in my own peace.